Hi, my name's Ann Haber, and today I'm going to demonstrate the anatomy of the endocrine system. So this looks like we're going to talk about the anatomy of the brain, but we're not. We're talking about the anatomy of the endocrine system. So we're going to talk about this gland and this gland. Okay? So this is the pituitary gland. This is the pineal gland. Now, the pituitary gland, if you will recall, when you were back studying bones, you learned that this bone was the sphenoid bone. And the sphenoid bone had that process called the sella turcica. And there was a depression in the sella turcica called the hypophyseal fossa, and also called the pituitary fossa. So there it is, right? So there's the hypophyseal fossa or the pituitary fossa, and look who rests right in there. The pituitary gland, beautifully protected. And it's a good thing it's beautifully protected because the pituitary gland secretes many, many hormones that are responsible for homeostasis. So also notice as a reminder here, we got a big sinus here, and let's remember that the perinasal sinuses are named after the bones that they are in. So here's the sphenoid sinus. Here's another perinasal sinus, that's the frontal sinus, okay? So here we have the pituitary gland resting inside the pituitary fossa or the hypophyseal fossa. Now, you can't really talk about the pituitary gland unless you also talk about the hypothalamus. So this is the hypothalamus, which is part of the diencephalon, and the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. The communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland happens through this stalk here called the infundibulum. Now, when we start talking about the hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland, we have some that are produced by the anterior pituitary and some that are produced by the posterior pituitary. So in this model, they're color-coded. The anterior pituitary gland, of course, is anterior. And the posterior pituitary gland, of course, is posterior. So the hypothalamus gives rise to the infundibulum, and the pituitary gland hangs from the infundibulum within the pituitary or hypophyseal fossa of the sphenoid bone. Take a look posteriorly here, and we have the pineal gland. The pineal gland hangs off of the epithalamus or the posterior aspect of the diencephalon. So that would be the pineal gland right here. So the hypothalamus, again, roughly shaped like a W, gives rise to the infundibulum, and then the infundibulum has the pituitary gland hanging from it, and the pituitary gland has an anterior portion and a posterior portion. And when you look at the gland, you do see that the anterior portion and the posterior portion look a little bit different from each other, and that's because the tissue that they're made of are different from each other, okay? So the tissue associated with the posterior pituitary gland resembles neural tissue, because remember that the hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary gland by way of paraventricular and supraoptic neurons, okay? So if you were to look at the histology, you would see that it kind of looks a little bit like neural tissue. It doesn't look like glandular tissue. So these would be the cells that contain the hormones of the posterior pituitary gland, which are oxytocin and ADH. Over here, we have the anterior pituitary gland. Now, the anterior pituitary gland secretes a lot of hormones. So it secretes growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone, the gonadotropic hormones, FSH and LH. And so there are a lot of different cells that create a lot of different hormones in the anterior pituitary gland. But the anterior pituitary gland does resemble more glandular tissue. So as you look at the anterior pituitary histology, you will see that this resembles glandular tissue. So you may see the posterior pituitary gland referred to as the neurohypophysis, and you may see the anterior pituitary gland referred to as the adenohypophysis, adeno implying glandular epithelial tissue, and neurohypophysis implying neural tissue. So this is the adrenal gland, adrenal, adrenal on top of the renal organ. So this is the kidney, and this is the adrenal gland, but they are absolutely separate organs and separate tissues. Okay. Now, the adrenal gland has a protective capsule around it, and then, like many other structures that we've studied, it has a cortex and it has a medulla. So the cortex is always the outer region, and the medulla is always the inner region. So there are several important hormones that come from the adrenal cortex, and there are several important hormones that come from the adrenal medulla. So this is a picture of the histology of the adrenal gland. And just to get you oriented on this image, this is going to be the superficial aspect of the adrenal gland. This is going to be the deep aspect of the adrenal gland. So let's remember that the adrenal gland was composed of the adrenal medulla. So this deep part is going to be the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal cortex, which is going to be this part right here, which looks fairly brownish, okay? And then out here, we had that protective capsule. That's the adrenal capsule out there made of connective tissue. So there are 3 regions of the adrenal cortex which produce the hormones of the adrenal cortex. So they are the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. Okay, so the zona glomerulosa is the region of cells that produces the mineralocorticoids, the most prominent of which is aldosterone. Now, next we have the zona fasciculata, and it mostly produces cortisol, but there's a few cells in here that will also produce the androgen precursor hormone. Okay, so zona fasciculata is mostly cortisol, mostly produces cortisol. Okay, and this is the zona reticularis, which produces the testosterone precursor DHEA, which will then become testosterone or else estrogen. So those are the zones and the hormones of the adrenal cortex. And then we move to the deepest part of the adrenal gland, again, the adrenal medulla. And we see cells called the chromaffin cells. These are the cells that produce the hormones of the adrenal medulla, and those hormones are epinephrine and norepinephrine. So just to get you oriented here to this model, we've got a little bit of the digestive system here, and we've got a little bit of the endocrine system here, and we've got a little bit of the urinary system here, okay? So here we have the pancreas, and the pancreas is an endocrine organ, and we'll discuss the histology of the pancreas and the hormones that come from the pancreas in a little bit. As a reminder, these are the kidneys, and that the adrenal glands sit superior to the kidneys. Here we have the spleen and the splenic artery and vein. Here we have a portion of the liver and the gallbladder, and we've got that duct work coming from the liver. We've got left hepatic duct, the right hepatic duct, the common hepatic duct, joining with the cystic duct from the gallbladder to form the common bile duct. And the common bile duct is going to join with the major pancreatic duct at the hepatopancreatic ampulla, or the ampulla of Vater. And the contents of those ducts are going to empty into the duodenum, by way of the major duodenal papilla. So that's all review. Here we have superior mesenteric artery and vein. And up here, which you can't see very much from this angle, is the hepatic portal vein, the common hepatic artery emptying into the liver. Okay, so that's all review, but let's get back to our endocrine system here. So here we have pancreas, part of the endocrine system, and the adrenal glands, part of the endocrine system. As we know, and as we will learn, there are also hormones associated with the liver as well. So the liver is also an endocrine organ. So this image in the middle is an image of the pancreatic islet, or the islets of Langerhans. There's many of these scattered throughout the pancreas. And then outside, on the edges of the islet of Langerhans, we have exocrine glands, again, part of the pancreas, but they are exocrine glands. They are not producing hormones. They are not considered endocrine glands. And these are producing the digestive enzymes that are associated with the pancreas. And those are composed of the acinar cells, or sometimes they're referred to as the pancreatic acini. So this is the islet of Langerhans, and there are three major cell types within the pancreatic islets: the alpha cells, the beta cells, and the delta cells. The alpha cells are generally more towards the center of the islet, and they produce glucagon. The beta cells are kind of light pink staining in this particular stain. They are light pink staining, and they tend to be more towards the edge of the pancreatic islet, and they, of course, produce insulin. And then we have the delta cells kind of scattered throughout the pancreatic islet, and they produce somatostatin. And these would just be blood vessels associated with the islet so that the hormones have their way of getting into the bloodstream. We're going to look at some endocrine organs within the neck and the thorax. So this is the thyroid gland. This is the thymus gland. Don't get them confused, okay? The thyroid gland is just inferior to the thyroid cartilage, and it's shaped like an H. It's a little bit hard to see on this. We'll take a look at it on a model as well. So it's shaped like an H. And again, it's just inferior to the thyroid cartilage. It has two lobes, and then the bridge that's in between the two lobes is called the isthmus of the thyroid. If we move further down into the thorax, we see the thymus. Okay? Now, the thymus is a gland that atrophies as we get older. So in an infant, the thymus is much larger than what this picture depicts. And this would most likely be the thymus of an adolescent maybe. And then in an adult, you would not be able to see the thymus very well because as we age, it does atrophy. Okay, it is within the mediastinum. Recall the definition of the mediastinum. The mediastinum is where the heart and the great blood vessels of the thorax reside. Okay, so that is where we would find the thymus if we could see it, and we will be most likely to see it in a teenager or a child or an infant. This is an anterior view of the thyroid gland. Remember, it's situated just inferior to the thyroid cartilage, and this part of it is the isthmus of the thyroid, and it would join the right lobe of the thyroid and the left lobe of the thyroid gland. Let's go ahead and move posterior to the thyroid gland. And we see these tiny other glands embedded into the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. And those are totally different tissue. That is the parathyroid glands. Those are the parathyroid glands. And they produce parathyroid hormone. important in calcium regulation. This is the histology of the thyroid gland, and it's pretty easy to identify the histology of the thyroid gland because there are these big, I call them like puddles or ponds of colloid or proteins. And this is where the thyroid hormone is made. That's where it's produced. With the help of these cells that line the colloid, and those are called follicular cells, or some people call them follicle cells. And so they produce the thyroid hormone. And then in between the colloid, we see another cell type here. So this cell type is going to produce the other thyroid hormone, which is calcitonin. And these are called parafollicular cells. So the parafollicular cells are in between these follicles of colloid, okay? And the follicular cells line the colloid, and the follicular cells make the thyroid hormone, and the parafollicular cells make the calcitonin. This is an anterior view of the male pelvis, and so the gonads in the male are the testes, the gonads in the female are the ovaries. So here we have the testes housed in the scrotum, and so these are the glands where the male sex hormones are made. This is a view of the female pelvis. We've got a bit of a lateral anterior view or an anterolateral view. So this is the pubic symphysis right here, okay? And so we're a little bit lateral over here. This is the bladder. This is the uterus. And the ovaries, or the female sex organs, which are also part of the endocrine system, they create the sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. They are situated at the end of the fallopian tube, but not attached to the fallopian tube. More about that in the reproductive system. But they are attached to the uterus by way of this ovarian ligament here. So those are the ovaries producing the female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and also a hormone called inhibin. So we've been discussing the endocrine system. So if we go from superior to inferior, we talked about the pituitary gland, which consists of the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary hanging from the infundibulum, which hangs from the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland, which is here in the posterior diencephalon. Inferior to the thyroid cartilage, we saw the thyroid gland. This is an anterior view. This is a posterior view of the thyroid gland, and embedded in the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, we find the parathyroid glands. Not on this picture and not prominently found in an adult, but what would be found in a baby or an adolescent would be the thymus gland. So it would be here surrounding these great blood vessels of the thorax. Moving down, we find the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys, and the adrenal glands consist of the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Moving further inferiorly, we see the pancreas, and we discussed the islets of Langerhans of the pancreas, as well as the exocrine glands associated with the pancreas, the islets of Langerhans containing the alpha, beta, and delta cells. And then moving inferiorly still, we have the male and female gonads. The ovaries are the female gonads, and the testes are the male gonads. The female ovary and the male testes, testis in singular, where the sex hormones are made.